Okay, you ready?
Yep. Just so you know, Tom, I'm in the office, so there might be some background noise or something, but
Okay.
yeah, shouldn't be too bad.
Okay, so I'm joined here today by Katya Henry. Katya is the QUT copyright officer, and I've invited Katya in particular, respond to a student question that we had on the Padlet this week. It was a really good question, and I wasn't so confident that I would give the correct answer. So I wanted to call in the experts. So thank you so much, Katya, for joining me.
No worries.
So this was a question, and it was from Sumudu. And the question is, I'm thinking of using a graph/figure published in an open access article for my confirmation presentation. So that's the context in this instance, confirmation presentation. But the figure says copyright 2020 and the author's names. Does that mean I cannot use the image without their written permission, even though the article is open access? So it seems to me that there's like the two main issues there. An understanding about what open access means, and then the context, which is a presentation, which is an oral presentation within the university for the confirmation. What is the answer to put Sumudu out of their misery?
It is a great question because it does cover a lot of different elements. So I've kind of highlighted the main parts of the question, and as you've suggested, Murray, there's the open access component of it and the context, which is the confirmation presentation. But the other parts to consider are the fact that it's a graph or figure, and your question about the fact that it states that the copyright belongs to the authors. First of all, I think if we just start with a bit of an overview of copyright, so we're all kind of on the same page, and you understand kind of what that copyright symbol means, who owns the copyright. So copyright is the automatic legal protection given to all original work which we create in a material form. So it's the protection that's given to the expression of an idea and not the ideas themselves. And copyright applies to artistic works, and that includes things like figures or graphs, as well as so-called literary works, which might be the text in the journal article, your thesis, a novel, even emails or tweets may be copyrightable. So within this article, you'll have different objects which will attract copyright. So you'll have the text of the article themselves, as well as any images or figures or tables. So each different element is copyrightable. And it's also important to note that copyright law differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So Murray, you've provided some sort of follow-on questions. So what would happen if an HDR student wanted to present their thesis in another country, for example, at an international conference? So it's important to note that copyright law might differ from country to country. So what might be allowable in the United States, for example, may not be permissible in Australia. So in Australia, the copyright owner has the exclusive right to publish a work, communicate a work, copy the work, in the case of a dramatic work, to perform the work in public or make an adaptation of the work. A Creative Commons license, though, is an international framework that applies across the board, across the world. So who owns the copyright? So as I said, it's automatic, and generally the author or creator of a work owns the copyright in that work. At QT, for example, students own their intellectual property and copyright in any work they produce. If you're a student at another institution, there may be a different policy, but at QUT, this would include any assessment items, including your thesis or any presentations you made. However, at QUT, as an employer, QT owns all intellectual property, including copyright created by staff in the course of their employment. It's also important to note that a copyright owner can transfer their copyright to another owner, such as with a publishing agreement. So often you'll find an article and you'll see copyright Elsevier. So in that case, the author of the paper has transferred the copyright to the publisher, and they no longer own the copyright or any of the rights to copy the work, communicate the work that then is owned by the publisher. In this case,
yes, this case.
Yeah,
I'm trying to
so
know
this
the
is
answer.
yeah, this is a Creative Commons open access journal article,
Yeah,
and the copyright is retained by the authors. So with a
yes,
Creative Commons license, you retain the copyright, but you give permission to users to use that material in different ways. So Murray, you said you've explained the different types of Creative Commons licenses to
yes,
your
it's
students.
in the content we provided. Yeah,
Yeah. So as you know, sometimes there might be a non-commercial component to it, or a no derivatives component, which means you can't change or alter the image in any way. But in this case, let's say it's a Creative Commons attribution license. That is the way of the authors giving you permission to use it how you like. You just have to attribute the copyright owners. So you can use it in any way you like. You can use it in your written thesis. You can use it in your confirmation presentation. You could use it at a conference. You could use it in a journal article, as long as you attribute.
To the question that Sumudu can use this figure from
doesn't matter what the context is, because the authors, by virtue of putting on that Creative Commons license, have given you permission to use it however you like.
We don't know if it was Creative Commons. It just says copyright.
It does say it's an open access article though.
Right.
And an open access article would have a Creative Commons license on it. That's what makes it open access. So the definition.
I would have thought that open access related to the fact that you didn't have to pay for to get access to the words of it.
No, not necessarily. That would be free to read. So an open access article does have to have a Creative Commons license on it. Otherwise, you can access an article just through a subscription to a database, but an open access article has that Creative Commons license tied into it. Another hint is the fact that the copyright is retained by the authors. In a subscription article, you're usually handing over the copyright to the publisher.
And so if that was the case, if it was not an open access, because in my experience, most articles that I come across, in fact, the ones that I use, they don't seem to be open access. It's only because I have university access that I'm able to get to them.
That's right. Yep.
In this case, would I have been able to use that table, that figure?
Yep. So as I mentioned, in different countries, there's different copyright law. So in Australia, we have fair dealing exceptions in our Copyright Act, and that will allow you to use copyright material without permission under certain contexts or certain applications. And that would include fair dealing for study or research. So that's individual research or study. So that would include, for example, using an image in your thesis and also your confirmation presentation. So that's part of your assessment process.
Right.
So you can use that graph or figure without permission under the fair dealing for research or study purpose. If you wanted to publish, however, it no longer sits under fair dealing. You would then be communicating and copying that work.
And does a recorded visual presentation, is that treated as publishing if it's put on the internet, for example, or even just live streamed to an open audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if it was part of the assessment, then that would be fine. That would come under fair dealing for research or study. If it was presenting it at a conference, however, that could be considered making it publicly available to the world, in which case you would need to obtain permission from the copyright holder.
Even if it's an open access?
So as I said, if it's an
article?
open access journal, if it's got that Creative Commons license on it, that is their permission to you. So you don't need to formally ask it. That's automatic.
Okay, so that's the key difference there.
Yeah.
If it's open to the world somehow, and it's not an open access journal, then permission is required.
Yeah,
but in
right.
most cases, and if it's an open access article, then the images can be used from it.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, you make a good point there. So just because something's like freely available, it's up on the internet, it doesn't mean it's free from copyright. So even if something doesn't have the copyright symbol on it, it's usually still protected by copyright. So unless it explicitly has that Creative Commons license or terms of use. So you might see on some government websites, for example, it may say that you can use that content for non-commercial purposes or for educational purposes. But the most common framework for providing that permission is the Creative Commons license. So if you don't see that, assume you would need to obtain permission unless you're using the work under one of the fair dealing exceptions. So as I said, there's fair dealing for research or study, which would include any assessment item. There's also fair dealing for criticism or review. So this might apply to you if you're using some copyright material in a publication. So for example, we had an academic who was doing an analysis of the way Wonder Woman's outfit had changed over time and how it represented things like American imperialism and things. So they were truly analyzing the images. So in those cases, they could use the images under fair dealing for criticism or review.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, but it depends on the publisher. So if you're wanting to publish something, so copyright's fairly subjective. It's not black and white.
Right.
So it would be if you wanted to publish an article and you were using images under.
Well, I've got another one. What
Yeah.
if so this query was about a graph / figure?
Yeah.
So it's could be treated as an image rather than words. What about a table?
Yep. Okay.
The table, and because I mean we can take words from a journal article, and all we need to do is put inverted commas around them, and we put a citation, and we need to contact the publisher to ask whether we need to use it.
Yep.
But once we take an image from an article, if it isn't open access, then we do. Is a table text or an image?
That's a tricky one. Yeah. So it depends. It depends. So so facts and data cannot be copyrighted, but the expression of those facts or data can be, and there's no defined threshold. So there needs to be some kind of original creative human input into it. So if you wanted to replicate a table in your own way, you could take just the data and present it in your own way. But if you wanted to just replicate the table, then you would need to obtain permission.
I see. Well, yeah, that's a great distinction. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and the other thing to note too is, when I was talking about the types of work that are copyrightable, an image is considered a whole piece of copyright in its own right. So you could use an insubstantial amount, which would be like an unidentifiable corner of an image. But if you wanted to use an identifiable section of it, then you have to get permission, whether it's
that sounds like it might be a little subjective. If
It's
identifiable or not.
completely subjective. So I've heard things like, oh, if I only use 30% of the image, or if I change it by 40%, it's fine, but it's entirely subjective. So that goes back to my point about it's often the publisher who will make that call. So if you're wanting to present your image at a conference, for example, it may be whoever's
You still
publishing
need
the
to contact the
proceedings.
publisher.
Exactly. Yeah.
I suppose one of the things that might put people off trying to contact the publisher is just the time that it might take to get a response.
Yeah, so there is, most publishers use the Copyright Clearinghouse to provide permission, and sometimes they'll charge for that right to use the copyright material. Sometimes they'll grant it for free. Sometimes they'll grant it for free one time. Sometimes they'll just refuse it outright. But it really is important before you go ahead and sort of incorporate that into your presentation that you obtain permission, especially if it's I guess high impact, if it's at an international conference that's being recorded and then streamed online and made available, on a website, then the risk is higher. Yeah. So I guess you need to take a risk management strategy with copyright, but it is the sole right of the copyright owner to copy it or to communicate it. So it's not just enough to say, oh, I'm using it for educational purposes, or I'm not making any money off it. That's beside the point.
Well, but the usage within an educational context, if you are a student, does seem to make a difference.
For research or study, for individual research or study,
Yes.
yeah. For teaching purposes, we have a whole other suite of licenses and things that allow us to do that. But there's no sort of blanket exception in Australian law that will allow you to use things for educational purposes. In America, you may have heard of fair use, which is a broader application of copyright material. And in those cases, you may be able to use the image if you're in America, for example, at a conference using an American copyright work, then you might be able to use it under fair use. But in that case, you check with the local publisher.
Okay.
Yeah. So
well, I think we've covered a fair amount of ground there.
It's pretty complex. Like I said, it's a juicy question and with sort of lots of different components. But if we go back to the original question, if it's an open access journal, to be truly open access, it needs to have a Creative Commons license on it. And that Creative Commons license gives you permission to use it. It's automatic permission as long as you adhere to the conditions of the license, that particular CC license.
Well, you've heard it here first. And, hopefully, Samudu, you have your answer. That the answer is, we think, yes.
If it's got that CC
well,
license.
okay, we think, as long as all those other things are in place. Yes. Don't just take our word for it, but you need to check the license.
Yeah. And if in doubt, just ask either myself, copyright
at
officer.
QUT or at other universities.
Exactly.
I'm sure there'll be equivalent people. So
yep.
Thank you so much for your time.
No worries, Murray.
Katya. And if we have any further questions, we'll call you.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
Cheers.